안녕하세요, 여러분의 한국어 선생님 고빌리입니다. This is the third episode in my series where I analyze the Korean speaking of the group ATEEZ, an 8-member group that debuted in 2018. So far, I've shared my analysis of 2 members, Hongjung and Seonghwa, and today I'll be breaking down the Korean speech of Yunho. But first, if you're new here, I'm a Korean teacher. I have 12 years of teaching experience and 20 years of learning the Korean language. So in this video, I'll break down the Korean speech of Yunho, including any unique expressions or any dialect that he uses, and giving my professional analysis of him as a Korean speaker and teacher. But before that, I need to thank the sponsor of this video, my Patreon supporters and also my channel members. The reason I don't have any sponsorships in these videos is because of you. And if you would like to help support my channel and to help me keep making more Korean language content, please consider becoming a Patreon member or channel member, and there are links in the video description box. As a member, you'll also get access to bonus content such as Korean cheat sheets, lesson outlines, and worksheets, and you'll get to help choose the next group that I analyze in a video just like this one. So let's get right into the topic of this video. Yunho.
제 이름을 불러주세요.
Yunho!
네, 맞습니다. 저는 댕디 에이티즈 윤호입니다. 안녕하세요.
Yunho was born in 1999 in the city of Gwangju, which is the 6th largest city in South Korea and is located in the southwest part of Korea in an area known as the South Jeolla province. He actually lived in Gwangju through middle school, and if you're wondering already, yes, he does speak some dialect, and I'll talk about that later. Actually, before he joined KQ Entertainment, he was already friends with another ATEEZ member, Mingi. In fact, here's Mingi describing his first impression of Yunho.
소개는 안 시켜줬어요. 그래서 제가 여기 앉아있고 윤호 여기 들어갔는데 이렇게 보고 와 진짜 잘생겼다 그랬는데 갑자기 막 내려와서 이제 지인분이 너는 이제 얘랑 이제 친해지고 막 같이 잘 지내봐 이렇게 하면서 소개시켜준 거예요.
And now here's Yunho describing his first impression of Mingi.
저도 민기를 처음 봤을 때는 뭔가 엄청 귀여웠거든요. 민기가 그때는 정말 귀엽고 사랑스럽고 근데 정말 춤 잘 추고 실력파다.
So he was complimenting Mingi, his first impression when he first saw him. And the two of them met when they were in high school and auditioned separately. And in fact, they didn't even know until they found out that they were both accepted as trainees. Imagine how that phone call went. Hey, I got accepted at KQ Entertainment. No way. I got accepted at KQ Entertainment. No way. Something like that. Okay, but back to Yunho. Let's talk about my first impressions. When I first heard him speak, I thought that he sounded like an announcer or a broadcaster. And if you hear him speak for just 10 seconds, you'll know what I mean. Here is him just introducing some watermelon punch, and it's so smooth and it sounds so professional.
네, 일단 저희의 그런 화채를 소개해드리도록 할게요. 저희 일단 되게 트로피컬하고 네, 일단 화려하죠. 색채가 다양해요. 그리고 과일이 파인애플, 망고, 수박, 그리고 토마토가 들어가 있습니다. 정말 다양하죠. 그리고 밀키스로 하여금
No one else cares.
신의 한 수였습니다.
He starts by describing how fancy it is, and then the color, and then all of the ingredients, and his voice sounds almost like he's advertising it in a commercial. And it's not just that he sounds professional, but no, he's legitimately good at pronouncing and speaking. I mean, here's an example of Yunho saying a very difficult tongue twister perfectly on his first try.
한영양장점 옆, 한양양장점, 한양양장점 옆, 한영양장점.
I mean, you try it. I'll put it on the screen and you can pause this video, and it's actually going to be my first time trying to say this tongue twister as well. 한영양장점 옆, 한영양장점, 한영양. That it's hard. And this is a really difficult tongue twister, but Yunho just nails it. And I think it just further shows how good of a speaker Yunho is. In fact, he also hosted the MBC show Idol Radio for its 3rd season together with Hongjung. And I'm pretty sure this is why he was selected to host that show, is because of how clearly he speaks.
좋습니다. 가차없이 진행되는 아이돌 라디오 시즌3 실시간 방송은요, NC 유니버스 어플을 통해 보실 수가 있고요. 네, 그럼 댕충디는 잠시 후에 찾아뵐게요.
So I think that Yunho is the clearest speaker in ATEEZ. His intonation is smooth and professional, and his pronunciation is flawless. Now, I'm not saying his Korean is easy to understand, especially if he uses any dialect or if he uses any difficult words, but at least it's easy to hear. Even when he's not speaking on a radio show or announcing anything, just his regular soft voice is still clear and easy to follow.
콘텐츠 너무 좋다.
감사합니다.
뭔가 이걸 함으로써 제 자존감도 조금 더 올라가는 것 같고 덕분에 자신감도 생기고 한층 더 앞으로 나아갈 수 있는 그런 힘을 얻은 것 같아서 저도 너무 좋은 시간이었던 것 같습니다. 감사합니다.
And it's not just the words that he uses, but also his intonation, which is just like something from a sales pitch. In fact, let's take a look at his intonation in a different clip.
편집 노돈 이게 다 저를 좋아해주는 이유구나. 항상 누구보다도 에이티니를 먼저 생각해주는 따뜻한 마음을 가지고 있는 사람이라서 감사합니다.
Listen to that last part of the sentence again and pay attention to how smooth his intonation sounds.
항상 누구보다도 에이티니를 먼저 생각해주는 따뜻한 마음을 가지고 있는 사람이라서
You can hear how smoothly he moves from one syllable to the next. Now, I mentioned this before, but here's how intonation typically works in Korean. Sentences will start by going up a bit at the very beginning and then down at the very end. And Korean doesn't have as many ups and downs as the English language for intonation. And Yunho's intonation is some of the smoothest that I've ever heard since I started this whole analysis series. Okay, so now I'm sure that you're already convinced that he sounds good, but I want to share one more example of his intonation.
진짜 먹방 오랜만에 하는 것 같은데? 마지막이 언제지? 제가 웬만해서는 이제 먹방을 안 보여줬었죠.
This is just him. He's talking out loud, but he's talking to himself. So he doesn't even need to speak clearly, but he still does. And the sentence that I want you to pay attention to is this part. Even talking out loud to himself, he still uses that same smooth intonation. He's not making his voice as loud or as clear as he would when he's talking to someone else, but the trademark of his clear voice is still there. So I completely understand why he hosted that radio show with Hongjung. And I also understand why he made news content on the ATEEZ YouTube channel.
이렇게 사소한 뉴스. 안녕하세요. 뉴스 앵커 정윤호라고 합니다. 박수! 긴급 속보인데요. 이터널 선샤인 애인찾기 촬영 현장에서 윤호 씨만 모르는 그런 비밀이 생겼다고 하는데요. 어떤 비밀인지 영상으로 빨리 확인해 보도록 하겠습니다.
Okay, but before I go on, I want to be clear that while, yes, he can sound like an announcer, no, he doesn't always speak with this sort of professional intonation. It's only when he wants to, and he's good at switching between his professional voice like this and his regular daily voice. Here's a clip where he's first addressing the audience using his presenter voice and then explaining what he has to do, and then calling his manager on the phone and speaking using his more regular daily voice. And you can hear that tone switch right when he answers the phone.
찐 매니저님께 그러면 노래 이어 부르기를 해보도록 하겠습니다. 네, 여보세요?
네, 여보세요?
네, 매니저님 저 윤호인데요. 매니저님 제가 전화를 드린 이유는 다름이 아니라 제가 미션을 하나 해야 돼요. 갑자기 드렸을 때 죄송한데
But even his regular voice, there's still a lot of that same smooth intonation. Okay, now I've hopefully convinced you that Yunho speaks clearly and smoothly, but what about the rest of his speech? Well, that smoothness and calmness in his voice doesn't define his entire personality. Because actually, Seonghwa, remember I showed you how he's obsessed with Legos and goofs off all the time. Seonghwa actually considers Yunho to be the funniest member in ATEEZ, and after watching enough clips, I think I can see why.
コアラが思い出します
꽈라 꽈라. 이거 어떻게 생각해? 야, 잘 섞인다. 야, 잘.
Pretty much whenever he can, Yunho is doing something goofy and trying to make others laugh.
이거?
Okay, moving on to the next topic, his usage of dialect, because Yunho was born in the city of Gwangju, and Gwangju has its own dialect that's different from the dialect you might hear used by Seonghwa or San, as we'll see in a future video. Gwangju is located within the South Jeolla province, and this area is also commonly referred to as Honam, which means south of the lake because it's located south of several lakes. One of the unique traits of dialects in this area is that instead of, say, Gyeongsang province dialects, like Busan dialect or Daegu dialect, or even Jinju dialect, which tend to have more wavy intonation, Gwangju dialect, however, its intonation is more smoother. And while Yunho's regular speaking is not at all dialect, I should clarify, his regular speaking is already very smooth as we heard, but when he speaks in dialect, it's even a bit smoother or at least the same.
이것이 멋이요.
This line from the song The Real is also an example of his Gwangju dialect. He says, 이것이 멋이요. And you'll see that ending 요 used in a ton of Gwangju dialect expressions. In standard Korean, this ending io would either be 입니다 in formal speech or 이야 in casual speech. So the ending io serves a dual purpose in that dialect. Okay, now I want to show you a couple more examples of his dialect.
이렇게 에이티즈를 만날 수 있어서 영광이요 불어요. 네, 사투리를 잘 못해 불어요. 네.
Here he uses that same yo ending, but he also uses another ending attached to it, 불어. Now, 불어, or here he actually says 불어요 to sound more polite, is a verb ending that's specific to the Gwangju dialect, and it's used to add emphasis to a sentence. So it makes an exclamation sound a bit stronger and adds more emotion to a sentence. And he uses this ending twice. Once first when he's saying that it's an honor to meet with ATEEZ, and a second time at the very end as he hands over the microphone, where he says that he doesn't speak dialect very well. And what he means is that while he knows the dialect, he's not able to use it as naturally as someone who lived their whole life in Gwangju.
저도 요즘 사투리 잘 못 알아들어요.
But actually, this is the norm for anyone who comes from a place with dialect, that unless they either live there for a very long time, like their whole life, or if they were raised by their grandparents or raised by a family member who spoke that dialect really strong, then it's usually common that most Koreans will just end up speaking the same as everyone else, as in the same as you would hear anyone speaking in Seoul for the most part. For Koreans who grow up in a place with dialect, if they didn't have those situations, then they might just grow up with a slightly different intonation from the region. And they might also be aware of some common dialect expressions that they heard others around them use while growing up. But these days, just because someone lives in an area known for its dialect doesn't mean they're going to speak that dialect well. Okay, on to the next clip of Yunho's dialect.
사투리 보여달라고? 사투리?
I can see him thinking.
씻어야 쓰겄다. 이거 맞나? 뭐, 밥 다 먹어서 배부르구만. 약간, 예, 해야 쓰겄다. 해야 쓰겄다잉. 그렇구만. 서울 사람 다 됐네. 그러니까 서울 사람 다 됐나 봐. 어떡해.
Here he's trying his best to think of things to say in his dialect, and he comes up with several fun endings. First he says, 씻어야 쓰겄다, and this is the dialect version of 씻어야 되겠다, meaning I have to wash up. So 되겠다 becomes 쓰겄다. In fact, he also uses 쓰겄다이, and this ending 다이 is also super common in Gwangju dialect. And it's essentially just 이 added to the end of the regular plain form. So if you have the verb 하다, you'd get 한다 in standard Korean in the plain form, or 한다이 in Gwangju dialect. And it's a really easy thing to change if you just want to start speaking with this dialect. In fact, you'll hear 이 added onto a lot of different verb endings. 하고 can become 하고이, 구만 can become 구마이, and so on. And Yunho also uses this ending 구마이 in that same clip. He says 다 먹어서 배부르구마이, meaning I finished eating and I'm full. And then he says 그렇구마이, which means like okay or I see. Okay, now, before I talk about his handwriting, I do want to spend just a tiny bit more time on his dialect. Because although Yunho doesn't use dialect often, there are a few things I did want to teach you about Gwangju dialect. And maybe you can use some of his dialect to him the next time that you meet him. So there are two more common endings that you should know that are used in Gwangju dialect. And the first is 시오 or sho. And this replaces the regular seo ending that you're probably familiar with. For example, in the expression 안녕하세요, 안녕하세요, you might say 안녕하쇼, 안녕하쇼. And one more ending that you should also know is 당께요, which is a polite verb ending that you might come across, and this is attached to the end of the regular plain form. So if you have the verb 하다, you'd get 한다 in standard Korean or 한당께요 in Gwangju dialect. And one more word that you should also know is probably the most famous dialect word from the Jeolla province, and that's the word 거시기, which is used to refer sometimes to a person or a thing that you're not sure what to call it. So you can translate it as kind of like so-and-so or thingamajig. And now this is actually a regular word in standard Korean too, but be careful using this word until you're already able to have full conversations in Korean, because if you use this word and there's no context, or if it's not clear exactly what you're trying to say, it can also sound like you're referring to the family jewels. But in Gwangju, this word is used more commonly. In fact, it's not only just used as a noun, but even it's used as a verb as 거시기 하다, which is a dialect verb that means not so good, or maybe a situation makes you feel uncomfortable. Like you might hear someone say 거시기 하네. Oh, and one more quick note about his dialect. I have another clip.
술 들어가요.
Here they ask him to use dialect and he says 술 들어가요, and he uses this ending 유. Now actually, and Woo-young correctly points this out, since he's the one who uses this ending in the song The Real,
춤 들어가요.
but the ending 유 is actually from the Chungcheong province and not the Jeolla province. And I'll talk about that too when we cover Woo-young later, who's also not from the Chungcheong province. But it's hilarious because you see Yunho's eyes get really big as he realizes that he used the wrong dialect. But it's okay, Yunho, we still love you. Hey, it's Billy, the video editor. I realized I forgot to film myself talking about Yunho's filler words. So really quick, he uses filler words pretty normally, but I was able to catch two filler words that I think he has a crush on. And here are some clips where he uses the first one.
아까 태국 무대 중에 약간 홍중이 형 정도? 약간 느낌이 안 사니까 약간 전체적인 약간 어색하긴 하지만 약간 다른 맛이야.
The word he's using is 약간, which means somewhat, and it's useful to soften a description of something. So instead of speaking directly, you can say it's somewhat and then the description. But the next filler word he uses, he really likes, and here are some clips. And I'm positive you won't need me to point it out.
는 되게 뜨거우면서 이거는 되게 안 끊고 되게 주니 맞아요. 저는 되게 그냥 그게 되게 큽니다. 되게 짧게 끊는 걸 되게 이상하면은 근데 그게 되게 달라요. 되게 스스로 추구하는 거 되게 좋아하고 이게 되게 늘 되게 요즘에 찍히는 걸 되게 좋아해요. 되게 1절이랑 2절 느낌이 되게 다른 느낌이라서 되게 좋았고.
Yes, he's saying 되게. 되게 a lot. 되게 is a slang word and means really or very. So it's used kind of like the word 진짜, which also means really. All right, thanks. Now let's get back to the rest of the video. All right, now let's change gears and talk for a moment about his handwriting. First, let's look at this letter, which all of the members wrote. And he wrote it as if it were his final letter before leaving into outer space. And my first impression of his handwriting is, for someone with easily the clearest speaking in the entire group, his handwriting sure is unique. I mean, it starts off okay at the top. 안녕하세요. Hello. Now, he rushed through writing this, so the 하세요 part is squished a bit. But moving on. 이제 곧 머나먼 우주로 떠나는 윤호입니다. I'm Yunho, who's now soon going to depart into the far reaches of space. easy enough to read and the writing looks okay. But then what's going on at the very bottom half of this letter? Specifically, look at this part. And if you know Hangul, please do try to follow along with me. In fact, even if you know Hangul, I won't blame you if you can't read this. 난 에이틴이가 되고 그동안 쭉 평생 우주의 별로 지냈던 것 같아. After becoming 18, I feel like I've spent my whole life as a star in the universe. 너무 고맙고 꼭 18이라는 우주의 별로 안전하게 돌아올게. 사랑해. Thank you so much, and I'll make sure to return safely as a star in the 18 universe. I love you. One thing I noticed is he tends to write some of his letters a bit sharp. Look at how he wrote the nan, the consonant nian, that's the letter N. It's written sharply and it's also a bit oversized. At the top of the letter, he wrote 전 얼마 뒤에. And the consonant tsiet as well, the J letter, is also written sharply, as well as many of his mium consonants, the M letter, such as in the middle where he wrote 모두 우주가. And the mo part here looks like he started writing a different letter and then changed it because this letter, the mium, is supposed to be written in just 3 strokes. But he actually wrote this with 4 strokes, each side as a separate stroke, and it also makes it look like a different letter, the consonant piup, which is the P letter, since that letter is written with 4 separate strokes. In addition, a lot of his letters here are either too small or a bit too large, like here where he wrote 지냈던 것 같아. He didn't add any spaces, and the middle part is written really small. And there are lots of spots in this letter where he squishes his syllables together like this. And he also tends to keep his pen pressed to the page when he's writing, so you'll see the lines that are connecting his syllables together. For example, toward the bottom where he writes 그동안 쭉 평생, which he wrote like this without picking up his pen from the page. So basically, my impression of this letter is just, it's a bit lazy. However, the words that he wrote are completely fine, and I could imagine him reading this entire letter out loud and hearing it in his voice, and it does match. Like this sentence here, 많이 위험할 수도 있다는 얘기를 들었지만 꼭 다치지 않고 몸 건강히 돌아올게. I've heard that it could be very dangerous, but I'll make sure not to get hurt and to come back healthy. And this sentence is exactly something that Yunho might say in his regular announcer voice. It's just a bit funny how, though, that his actual handwriting doesn't seem to match the smoothness of his speaking. But let's look at a different letter now that he wrote to Eitini. Since this is a letter that he wrote knowing his fans were going to read it, I assume that he will have put more effort into writing it as nicely as possible and kind of. I mean, yeah, it is better than the other letter that we saw. His syllables are now mostly the same size and everything is more legible, but he still tends to write his syllables a bit squished together and it makes it difficult to read quickly. For example, the second line he writes, 제가 중대한 뉴스 특종을 들고 왔는데요, meaning I brought a breaking news story. And he wrote this word 특종 with the consonant iung, that's the circle letter, just as a dot. He also tends to leave the consonant iung unfinished when he doesn't write it like that. So they kind of look like backwards C's, like in the first sentence where he writes 에이틴이. And he does the same thing with the consonant hiat. That's the H letter, since it also is a circle with 2 lines on top of it. So in that sentence I gave, 제가 중대한, the circle letter in han is left open. Now, that's not a big deal. It's just something to look out for. And honestly, my eyes kind of hurt now. So I think that's enough of his handwriting for today. So if you're looking for an ATEEZ member with extra clear speech and a bit of flair, someone to use for listening practice or any of those, then I also give Yunho my Korean teacher stamp of approval. Okay, and I could keep going on, but there are still 5 more members, so that's enough for today. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and also subscribe to my channel for more Korean learning content. Thank you again to my Patreon supporters and channel members. And if you would like to support my channel, there are links to my Patreon page and to become a channel member in the video description box. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time. 그럼 다음에 또 봐!